The alien's breathing was wrong. Nea Solen noticed it before the translation software caught up with the creature's words. The Dhurathi prisoner sat across the steel table in interrogation suite 7, its four-jointed arms bound behind the chair with magnesium core restraints, and its lung sacs were cycling at a rate that Nea's training files classified as pre-deceptive. Not fear, not pain. The particular respiratory pattern that a Dhurathi exhibited when it was constructing a lie that it believed would be accepted. The strike on the Accord summit was a field commander's initiative, the prisoner said. Its voice came through the room's translation matrix as a flat baritone, stripped of the harmonic undertones that Dhurathi used to convey sincerity. No authorization from the Ecclesiast Council, a rogue action, we condemn it. Nea turned a stylus between her fingers without looking at it. She was watching the prisoner's secondary ocular membranes. They were half-closed, a posture the Dhurathi physiological briefings described as composure display, a performance of calm. She had studied those briefings for 4 years before this assignment. Memorizing the involuntary tells the way a card player memorizes the micro-expressions of an opponent who does not know he is being read. 17 diplomats, Nea said, 11 security staff, 4 civilian translators, a ceasefire summit hosted under neutral auspice. Your field commander decided to annihilate an entire delegation during a declared truce, without orders, and your Ecclesiast Council had no advanced knowledge. Correct. Then explain why the strike corridor matched the delegation's updated route, the one we transmitted to the neutral mediator 40 minutes before arrival. The route change was classified. The mediator was the only external party with access. The prisoner's secondary membranes opened slightly, a fraction of a millimeter that told Nea more than 20 minutes of denial had. She let the silence hold. Interrogation Suite 7 was a hard-walled room aboard the intelligence carrier INS Blackthorn, parked in a quarantine orbit above the neutral station, where the Accord summit had been held 6 days ago. The station was dark now. Its atmosphere processors were still cycling, but nobody was aboard. The debris from the delegation's transport had been collected, cataloged, and stored in a forensic bay 3 decks below this room. 32 body bags in a refrigerated hold, each one tagged with a name and a service number and a next-of-kin notification status. Nea had read every name. She carried them in the back of her mind like a ledger that would not close. The mediator, the prisoner said, is not within my sphere of information. The mediator was the Selvari Compact. Nothing moved on the Dhurathi's face, but the breathing changed again, faster, shallower. The pre-deceptive pattern had collapsed into something rawer. The prisoner was surprised that she knew. Nea placed a data tablet on the table between them, face up. The screen showed a communication intercept, a signal fragment that the Blackthorn's electronic warfare suite had recovered from the debris field around the destroyed summit transport. A burst transmission, encoded in Selvari diplomatic cipher, sent 14 minutes before the Dhurathi strike craft entered the corridor. This transmission originated from the Selvari mediator's vessel, Nea said. It was directed to a Dhurathi military relay station in the Keth Narrows. It contained the delegation's updated route, their shield harmonics, the transport's engine signature, and the exact window during which the delegation's escort would be cycling through a sensor recalibration. 14 minutes before your strike craft appeared. The prisoner stared at the tablet. Its secondary membranes were fully open now, and for the first time in the interrogation, Nea saw something that looked like genuine calculation behind those layered eyes. Not guilt, not remorse. The Dhurathi did not process those concepts the way humans did. What she saw was a creature reassessing the cost of its current strategy. I will not comment on Selvari communications, the prisoner said. You don't need to. The communication is authenticated. The cipher has been broken. The content is verified. What I need from you is the name of the Dhurathi officer who received this transmission and authorized the strike. Your field commander didn't go rogue. He received targeting data from an allied mediator and executed a pre-planned ambush on a ceasefire delegation. That's not initiative. That's conspiracy. The prisoner closed all four of its eyes for 3 seconds. When it opened them, the composure display was gone. What replaced it was something Naya had seen in only 2 other Dhurathi interrogations across her 12-year career. The expression of a creature that understood it was in the presence of someone who already knew the answers and was simply documenting the proof. Fleet Prelate Dhurathi Ken, the prisoner said. Naya wrote the name on her stylus pad without inflection. She had already known it. The Blackthorn Signals intelligence team had identified Ken's command signature on the strike craft's formation orders 18 hours ago. But she needed the prisoner to say it. She needed it on the record, spoken into the suite's multi-redundant audio capture system, corroborated by a Dhurathi source who could be presented to the interstellar arbitration bodies that would never convene because Earth was not going to arbitrate. Tell me about Ken's communication with the Selvari vessel. I don't have details on. You served on Ken's staff, Signals Division. You handled his secure traffic for 11 months before the summit. I have your personnel file. I have your duty logs. I have the routing headers on every encrypted transmission that passed through your console. 3 of them match the Selvari diplomatic cipher that carried the targeting data. You didn't just relay messages. You formatted them for transmission. You were the bridge between Ken and the Selvari operative. The prisoner's breathing stopped entirely for 2 seconds. In Dhurathi physiology, that was the equivalent of a human's blood draining from their face. Names, Naya said. Every name you have. Every contact on the Selvari side that you interacted with directly or through encrypted channels. The prisoner gave her 4 names. 2 were low-level Selvari diplomatic staff, whose roles Naya had already mapped, and discounted clerks who handled scheduling and facility coordination, too peripheral to have had access to the targeting data. 1 was a Dhurathi intelligence liaison she had already identified in the Blackthorn's intercept logs, a middle-tier operative who served as a message conduit between the Ecclesiast Council's intelligence branch and their external assets. The 4th was new, a Selvari External Analysis Bureau handler designated in the prisoner's communications as Arbiter 7. No real name, an operational call sign. She stood and gathered her tablet. The prisoner watched her with an expression she could not quite classify. What happens now? It asked. Now I find Arbiter 7. And then the people who decide what happens next will decide what happens next. The prisoner's breathing hitched. That was the fear pattern, finally. Naya walked out of interrogation suite 7 and turned left toward the Intelligence Operations Center, which the crew called the cage. The corridor was gunmetal gray, lit by overhead strips that cast a flat, institutional light. She passed 2 Marine sentries who acknowledged her with nods but no words. They had heard the name Accord Summit. Everyone aboard the Blackthorn had. The name had become a shorthand for something that did not need explaining. The thing that had been done, the line that had been crossed, the 32 human beings who had gone to a peace negotiation and come back in bags. 6 days ago, Naya had been in this same corridor when the first alert came through. She had been walking to the galley for a cup of the reconstituted coffee that tasted like engine lubricant, and was the only thing aboard the Blackthorn that could be consumed hot at any hour. The alert tone had cut through the ship's ambient hum, 3 sharp pulses, followed by a sustained whine that every intelligence operative recognized as a priority flash. She had turned around, walked back to the cage, and found the raw feed already on the central display. The delegation's transport had been destroyed. The feed showed the debris field a spreading cloud of hull fragments, atmosphere gases freezing into crystal plumes, emergency beacon signals that activated automatically and transmitted distress codes to receivers that would never send a rescue, because there was nothing left to rescue. The transport's black box telemetry, recovered by the Blackthorn signals drone within the hour, showed the attack sequence in clinical detail. 6 Dhurathi strike craft, entering the transit corridor in a spread formation, firing a volley of precision munitions that hit the transport's engine nacelles, shield generators, and bridge in a coordinated strike that lasted 4 seconds. The transport's escort, a pair of corvettes running a routine sensor recalibration cycle, did not detect the strike craft until the first missiles were already in terminal approach. They fired countermeasures that arrived too late to do anything but illuminate the debris. 4 seconds, 32 lives. Naya had stood at the central display and read the telemetry twice. Then she had turned to her team and said, "Cancel all scheduled work. This is the only file that exists until it's closed." Nobody had argued. Nobody had asked how long it would take. They had simply opened their consoles and begun. In the 6 days since, Naya had slept 11 hours total, eaten when food was placed at her console by analysts rotating through the galley, and constructed the evidence architecture that had led, link by link, from the debris field to the Dhurathi strike craft, from the strike craft to Fleet Prelate Ken's formation orders, from Ken's orders to the burst transmission from the harmonium, and from the harmonium to the prisoner sitting in interrogation, Suite 7, whose breathing patterns she had just finished reading like a document in a language she had spent her career learning to translate. The cage occupied the Blackthorn's central bay, a hexagonal room packed with analysis stations, signal intercept consoles, and a central holographic display that currently showed a 3-dimensional map of the space surrounding the neutral station. Naya's team of 6 analysts was already assembled. They had been working in shifts since the delegation's transport was destroyed, and most of them had not slept properly in 4 days. Analyst First Class Dane Rossa had coffee stains on both sleeves and an expression that oscillated between exhaustion and cold focus. Analyst Marin Soy was eating a protein bar at her console while scrolling through decrypted Selvari traffic with her free hand. Senior Analyst Kira Vestron was cross-referencing personnel files against financial databases with the mechanical intensity of someone who had stopped feeling tired and entered the state beyond it. The rest were deep in their feeds, building the evidence architecture that Naya had been constructing since the first hour after the attack. She uploaded the interrogation recording to the central node and pinged the team. "I have a name confirmation on the Dhurathi side. Fleet Prelate Dhurathi Ken authorized the strike after receiving the targeting package from the Selvari mediator vessel. That's the kill chain on the military end. I also have a new lead. An operative designated Arbiter 7 on the Selvari side, a handler for the External Analysis Bureau. We need to match that call sign to a real person." Rossa looked up from his console. "What about the Selvari end? Who on their ship sent the transmission?" "That's what Arbiter 7 gets us. The handler ran the operative. Find the handler, and we know who they ran." Naya pulled up the Selvari mediator vessel's crew manifest on the central display. The ship was the SCV Harmonium, a diplomatic cruiser that the Selvari Compact had provided as the neutral platform for the ceasefire negotiations. Its crew of 46 had been vetted by both Earth and the Dhurathi before the summit. The burst transmission was sent from a secondary communications array on the Harmonium's engineering deck. That array is accessible to 11 crew members. "Soy, where are we on the behavioral analysis?" Soy put down her protein bar. "We've been running analysis on the Harmonium's crew for 2 days. Internal movement logs, communication patterns, financial records where we can access them. I've got 3 candidates who had both access and opportunity." "Show me." The display shifted to 3 personnel files. Naya studied them with the focused patience of a woman who had spent 12 years learning that intelligence work was not about intuition. It was about evidence. It was about building a chain of facts so clean and so complete that the conclusion was not a judgment but a mathematical inevitability. The first candidate was the Harmonium's senior communications officer, a Selvari named Kial Tessarn. He had access to the secondary array. He had been on the engineering deck during the window when the transmission was sent, and he had a financial irregularity in his personal accounts that flagged an unexplained deposit of Dhurathi trade credits 4 months prior to the summit. The second was a junior diplomatic aide named Voss Rennet. Array access confirmed, present in the adjacent corridor during the transmission window. Encrypted contacts with a Dhurathi commercial entity that intelligence had flagged as a front for the Ecclesiast Council's covert operations branch. The third was the Harmonium's executive officer, Commander Ashai Droon. Array access confirmed. No verified alibi for the transmission window. 2 previous postings in regions where Selvari Dhurathi intelligence cooperation had been documented by Earth's signal assets. Vestrin, Nea said, I need you to run the callsign Arbiter 7 against every communication we've intercepted from the Selvari External Analysis Bureau in the last 18 months. Every frequency, every cipher, every fragment. If that callsign appears in traffic connected to any of these 3, that's our operative. Vestrin nodded and bent over her console. The search would take hours. Nea could not afford to wait for it. Run the elimination in parallel. Tsoi, take Tessarn. Rasa, take Rennet. I'll work Droon. We build or break each case independently. If the callsign match comes back before we finish, it confirms. If it doesn't, we build enough to confirm without it. The team dispersed to their stations. The cage fell into the particular silence of focused work, the low hum of data feeds, the soft click of keystrokes, the occasional murmured exchange between analysts cross-checking a data point. Nea opened Commander Droon's file and began pulling threads. She started with the sensor gap. The Harmonium's internal monitoring system used a network of biometric and motion sensors distributed through every corridor and compartment. On the day of the attack, 2 sensor nodes at a corridor junction between the crew quarters and the engineering deck had been experiencing intermittent failures. The failures had been logged 3 days before the summit. They had been reported by Droon herself. The repair had been scheduled for after the summit's conclusion, on Droon's authority as executive officer. Nea pulled the maintenance logs for those 2 sensors for the previous year. They had operated without a single failure for 9 months. The intermittent failures began exactly when the summit preparations were finalized, and the Harmonium was designated as the host vessel. She flagged this and kept moving. She ran the executive officer's communications metadata through a pattern analysis tool that flagged anomalous contacts communications that fell outside the expected profile for Droon's rank and role. Most of an executive officer's traffic was internal: maintenance orders, crew scheduling, operational reports to the Harmonium's captain. Droon's profile showed exactly that, plus a series of encrypted personal messages routed through a civilian relay network that the Selvari Compact's diplomatic vessels used for crew morale communications. The messages were addressed to an entity registered as a private correspondence service on the Selvari homeworld. The service's registration records, when Nea pulled them through the Blackthorn's access to interstellar commercial databases, showed a shell entity with no physical address, no listed employees, and a registration date that coincided with Droon's transfer to the Harmonium, a communications channel built specifically for this operation. Nea flagged the shell entity and kept building. 40 minutes into the analysis, Tsoi's voice broke the silence. Tessarn's eliminated. Station telemetry reconstruction puts him in the Harmonium's medical bay during the transmission window. Respiratory infection treatment. His financial irregularity traces to a legitimate family inheritance, a Dhurathi territory trading, post his family has operated for 2 generations. The deposit matches a quarterly distribution payment. He's clean. 1 down. Nea updated the evidence map and continued. An hour later, Rasa pushed back from his console. Rennett's circumstantial case is strong on paper, but it falls apart under weight. His Dhurathi contacts predate the summit by 2 years' academic research on theological law. He published 3 papers on Dhurathi liturgical structure through the University of Kale. His presence in the corridor during the transmission window matches a documented exercise routine that his fitness tracker confirms on 63 of the previous 65 days. The 2 exceptions were days the ship was at high alert. I can't build a chain that holds. Coincidence is not evidence, Naya said. Log it and move on. 2 down, that left Droon. Naya summoned the Harmonium's captain to the Blackthorn for an interview, not an interrogation, but the kind of careful, respectful conversation that intelligence operatives conducted with subjects who might be witnesses rather than targets. Captain Shale Orvis was a Selvari career naval officer who had commanded the Harmonium for 3 years and who showed every sign of genuine shock at the attack. Naya interviewed him in Conference Room 2, a space less hostile than the interrogation suite, with tea provided and the recording equipment visible rather than concealed. Commander Droon requested the Harmonium posting 6 months before the summit was announced, Orvis said. His hands were wrapped around the tea vessel, and his voice carried the particular weariness of a man who had spent 6 days understanding that something terrible had happened on his ship and that he had not seen it. She came through the External Affairs Personnel Office. Her service record was exemplary. 2 prior postings in frontier diplomatic stations. No flags. Did you know she had served with the External Analysis Bureau? Orvis looked at Naya as if she had told him the deck was on fire. The Bureau? No. Her record listed frontier diplomatic stations, standard postings. There was nothing about intelligence work. Her personnel bypass was authorized by Compact Director Solon. The captain set down his tea. The vessel clinked against the table's surface, a small sound that carried a large silence. Solon selected the Harmonium for the summit, Orvis said slowly. He told me it was because of our ship's neutral zone experience. He said the Earth delegation specifically requested a vessel with our operational profile. Earth made no such request. Orvis closed his eyes. When he opened them, the shock had been replaced by something harder. Droon managed the summit's internal logistics. She controlled the sensor maintenance schedule. She approved all crew access authorizations for the engineering deck. She had more operational control over the ship's internal systems during the summit than I did. I delegated it because she was my executive officer, and because the summit protocols required the captain to be present at the negotiation table during all sessions. Which meant you were not on the ship when the transmission was sent. I was in the conference chamber on the neutral station, with the delegation. I heard the first missile impact through the station's hull. Naya made a note. Orvis was not involved. He was a victim of the same deception that had killed the delegation, a captain whose ship had been used as a weapon while he sat in the target's conference room. She thanked him, returned to the cage, and began the reconstruction. Droon's movements had to be rebuilt from the fragmented telemetry, with the care of someone reassembling a shattered vase. Every shard had to fit. The backup telemetry from the neutral station was patchy, corrupted by the same strike that had killed the delegation, but between the station's logs, the Harmonium's internal sensors, and the passive electromagnetic recordings that the Blackthorn's own surveillance suite had been making of the neutral zone, she assembled a minute-by-minute account. At 1847 station time, Droon logged off the Harmonium's bridge and reported to her quarters for a rest period. At 1903, she left her quarters. The Harmonium's internal sensors lost her in the corridor junction, where the 2 conveniently failed nodes created a blind spot, the only blind spot on the vessel that connected the crew quarters to the engineering deck. At 1911, a figure consistent with Droon's biometric profile appeared on a secondary sensor at the entrance to the engineering deck. At 1917, The burst transmission left the Harmonium's secondary communications array. At 1923, Droon reappeared on the primary sensors in the corridor outside her quarters. At 1931, the Dhurathi strike craft entered the delegation's transit corridor. 14 minutes from transmission to kill. Naya cross-referenced the sensor gap with the Harmonium's full layout. She mapped every sensor node in the vessel, drew every possible route between the crew quarters and the engineering deck, and calculated the coverage overlap for each. The two failed nodes were the only pair that would create an unmonitored path. Any other route would have been captured on at least 3 functional sensors. Droon had studied the sensor grid, identified the single exploitable weakness, and then used her authority as executive officer to create that weakness and prevent its repair. The precision of it told Naya everything she needed to know about the woman she was hunting. This was not an amateur recruited late. This was professional intelligence tradecraft, the kind of counter-surveillance discipline that came from years of training within a state apparatus. She turned to Droon's service record. Her 2 previous postings were not field assignments. They were intelligence postings with the Selvari Compact's External Analysis Bureau, the Compact's Foreign Intelligence Service. Her transfer to the Harmonium had been processed through a personnel channel that bypassed the standard vetting protocol Earth security team had relied on. The bypass authorization carried a single signature, Compact Director Arvith Solon. Naya pulled Solon's profile and felt the architecture of the case shift beneath her like tectonic plates realigning. Solon was not a mid-level bureaucrat. He was the Selvari Compact's Director of External Affairs, the senior official responsible for the Compact's relationships with both Earth and the Dhurathi Ecclesiast Council. He had personally recommended the Selvari Compact as neutral mediator for the ceasefire summit. He had personally selected the Harmonium as the host vessel. He had personally authorized the personnel bypass that placed an intelligence operative aboard that vessel in a position of operational control. Vestron's console chimed. Everyone in the cage looked up. "Call sign match," Vestron said. Her voice was flat, controlled, but her hands were not quite steady on the keyboard. Arbiter 7 appears in 17 intercepts over the last 14 months, all External Analysis Bureau traffic. The handler's communications correlate with operational planning for what the Bureau internally designated Project Quiet Bridge. The handler's identity is encrypted in every intercept except one, a personnel authorization form that cross-references the call sign with a Bureau employee number. That employee number belongs to Compact Director Arvith Solon. The cage was silent for 3 seconds. Then Rossa said, very quietly, "The Director of External Affairs was personally running the operative who killed our delegation." Naya stared at the evidence map on the central display. The lines of connection were clean, documented, and damning. Solon had conceived the operation under the codename Project Quiet Bridge. Solon had recommended the Selvari Compact as neutral mediator. Solon had selected the Harmonium as the host vessel. Solon had placed Droon aboard through a personnel bypass he personally authorized. Solon had handled Droon as Arbiter 7 through a shell communications channel. Droon had manufactured the sensor gap, harvested the delegation's security profile from the shared ceasefire briefings, and transmitted the targeting data to Fleet Prelate Ken's relay station in the Keth Narrows. Ken had executed the strike. The conspiracy chain was unbroken from the Selvari government's most senior external affairs official to the Dhurathi missiles that entered the delegation, transport's engine signature window. The ceasefire had been a trap. The entire mediation framework had been engineered as a kill box. She thought of Ambassador Gideon Reach, who had spent 11 months building the ceasefire framework that the Selvari Compact was simultaneously building into a weapon. Deputy Ambassador Lena Vasic, who had a daughter at university on Earth, who did not yet know her mother was dead because the next of kin notification traveled at communication speed, and the missiles had traveled faster. Security Chief Warrant Officer Doran Malek, who had joked with Naya over a secure channel 3 hours before his death about the quality of the neutral station's coffee. Translator Emmy Fontaine, 26 years old, first diplomatic posting, who had packed formal clothes she would never wear to a reception that would never happen. Translator R.F. Patel, who had taught himself the Dhurathi liturgical dialect in his own time, because he believed understanding the enemy's sacred texts would help bridge the divide. Every one of them had walked into that summit because they trusted the process. They trusted the neutral mediator. They trusted the Selvari Compact. "Assemble the final package," Naya said. "Every intercept, every telemetry reconstruction, every financial record, every personnel file, every authenticated fragment. Classification absolute. Transmit to Earth combined authority." Rasa hesitated. "Solen, if we transmit this, we're telling Earth that an ally, a power we've worked with for 40 years, a power that mediated 3 previous disputes on our behalf, deliberately murdered our diplomatic delegation as state policy. The response to that won't be diplomatic. I know what the response will be. Just making sure we're all clear on what we're building here. We're building the truth, Rasa. What happens with it isn't our decision, but the truth has to be clean enough that the decision is unambiguous." He nodded and turned back to his console. The room was quiet for the next 2 hours while the team assembled the final architecture. Vestron added the 17 Arbiter 7 intercepts, each one individually authenticated and cross-referenced with the Bureau's internal communication logs. Tsoi added the shell entity's registration records and the financial trail that connected it to the Bureau's operational budget. Rasa added the Tessarn and Rennet elimination cases, because a thorough investigation documented not only the answer it found, but the answers it ruled out. Naya added the interrogation recordings, the telemetry reconstructions, the Orvis interview, and her own analysis of Droon's sensor gap manufacturing. The package was complete by 3:40 station time. 47 pages of evidence, cross-referenced and annotated, building from the Dhurathi prisoner's confirmation through the Selvari cipher break, through Droon's manufactured sensor gap, through Solen's personnel bypass, through the Arbiter 7 call-sign match, to the conclusion that the Selvari Compact's government had orchestrated the assassination of Earth's ceasefire delegation as a deliberate act of state policy. The response came in 91 minutes, not from Fleet Command, not from the Intelligence Directorate, from the combined authority, the joint civil-military body that convened only when the decision being made would reshape the strategic landscape of human space. The message was 2 sentences. Evidence accepted. Crucible Protocol authorized. Naya had heard of the Crucible Protocol. Every senior intelligence operative had. It existed in classified doctrine as a contingency for a specific scenario, the confirmed betrayal of Earth by a trusted allied power, resulting in the deliberate killing of human diplomatic personnel during a declared truce. The doctrine was older than Naya's career. It had been written by people who understood that the worst threat to a civilization was not an enemy who attacked openly, but an ally who sold you to the enemy while shaking your hand. The protocol's architects had specified the response posture in precise terms: overwhelming force, absolute strategic dominance, complete military disarmament, and the surrender of every individual in the conspiracy chain. The response was not punitive. It was mathematical. It calculated the force required to make resistance irrational, and then applied that force without negotiation. She walked to the cage's communication station and opened a priority channel to the Blackthorn's commanding officer, Captain Leos Rand. "Sir, Crucible Protocol is authorized." Rand's voice came back without hesitation. "Copy. What's the posture?" "State-level conspiracy. The Selvari Compact's External Affairs Directorate orchestrated the insertion of an intelligence operative onto the ceasefire mediation vessel, harvested our delegation's route and security profile, and transmitted targeting data to the Dhurathi strike force. The authorization chain runs from Compact Director Arvith Solon through Bureau, Operative Ashai Droon, to Fleet Prelate Doreth Ken. Solon is a government official. This means the Compact's leadership either ordered this or permitted it. The evidence supports ordered. The personnel bypass, the ship selection, the 14-month operational planning under Project Quiet Bridge, this was structured from the beginning. Fleet disposition. The Selvari Compact maintains 11 patrol corvettes and 3 destroyer-class vessels in their home system. Their nearest allied fleet assets are the Dhurathi's Keth Narrows Picket, approximately 48 hours at standard transit. Earth has the 9th Expeditionary Group on station at Waypoint Talos, 14 hours from the Selvari home system. The 9th is 42 ships. That won't send the right message. No, sir. Crucible Protocol calls for overwhelming force. The doctrine specifies a response ratio that makes retaliation mathematically impossible. What's available within 72 hours? Nea had already run the numbers. She had run them while building the evidence package, because she had known, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent a career studying the arithmetic of consequences, that the evidence would be accepted and the protocol would be authorized. If we pull the 9th Expeditionary from Talos, the 14th Battle Group from Meridian Station, the 22nd Heavy Squadron from the Cortez Line, and the Reserve Carrier Division from Saul Anchorage, we assemble approximately 14,000 combat vessels. That includes 26 dreadnoughts, 84 cruisers, and the fleet carrier Resolute with its full strike wing complement of 600 craft. The number hung in the Channel's silence. 14,000 warships, against a power that maintained 14 combat vessels in its home system, a ratio of 1,000 to 1, the kind of disproportion that did not require a single shot to communicate its message, though shots would be fired if the message was not received. Assemble them, Rand said. A pause, then, Solène, one more thing. The evidence package you built, it's the foundation for everything that follows. If any link in that chain is weak, the response loses its moral authority. Is the chain clean? Every link is documented, corroborated by at least 2 independent sources, and authenticated against original data. The chain is clean. Good, then we move. The orders went out within the hour. Nea watched them propagate across the secure fleet channels, precisely worded directives telling 4 fleet groups to break from their current assignments and converge on coordinates that formed a sphere around the Selvari Compact's home system. The orders carried the Crucible Protocol designation, and every flag officer who received it understood what it meant without additional explanation. An ally had betrayed Earth's trust with blood. The betrayal had been proven. The response was predetermined. The next 72 hours were the most precisely coordinated military operation Nea had ever witnessed from an intelligence vantage point. She tracked it from the cage, monitoring communications traffic across all 4 fleet groups as they converged with the synchronized precision of a closing fist. Every order was copied to her console because the Crucible Protocol designated the intelligence carrier's operations center as the evidentiary node. Every action taken in the response would be documented, time-stamped, and archived as part of the same evidence architecture that had triggered it. The investigation and the fleet were the same instrument. Nea's job was to ensure the instrument was precise. The 9th Expeditionary departed Waypoint Talos at 600. 42 ships, dreadnoughts in the center, cruiser screens on the flanks, destroyers running point. Their transit vector took them along the Selvari Compact's primary trade lane, ensuring that every commercial sensor platform between Talos and the Selvari border recorded their passage. The 9th's commanding officer, Vice Admiral Pren Korath, transmitted a single fleet-wide order before departure. All stations, combat configuration. no drills. This is not an exercise. The 14th Battle Group broke orbit from Meridian Station at 6:14. 61 combat vessels, including 8 heavy cruisers, and the battleship Arbiter, 400 meters of angular gray hull, covered in the scars of 2 previous engagements. Its main battery, capable of reducing an orbital platform to vapor in a single salvo. The 14th's transit vector came from galactic north, perpendicular to the 9th's approach, so that the Selvari sensor network would register 2 separate formations converging from different directions. The 22nd Heavy Squadron peeled off the Cortez line patrol at 700. 38 ships, lean and fast, commanded by Rear Admiral Vesper Cole, a woman whose service record contained the notation, decisive engagement resolution, more times than any other active flag officer in the fleet. Cole's squadron took the shortest route, a high-energy transit that would bring them out directly above the Selvari Compact's primary orbital trade station. The Reserve Carrier Division departed Saul Anchorage at 1900, having achieved combat readiness 3 hours ahead of the standard timeline. The division's centerpiece was the Resolute, an Everest-class fleet carrier that measured 4 kilometers from bow to stern. Its flight decks carried 600 strike craft in 4 operational wings. Its escort group numbered 72 cruisers and destroyers. The Reserve Division's transit vector would bring it in last, arriving at the 72-hour mark, dropping into position between the Selvari home system and the Dhurathi Keth Narrows picket, sealing the last exit from the sphere. Nea tracked the Selvari Compact's reaction as their sensor networks began detecting the approaching formations. She maintained a parallel channel to the Blackthorn's signals intelligence team, which was intercepting and decoding the Selvari government's internal communications in near real time. Every panicked message, every hurried consultation, every order issued to the Selvari's meager defense forces was captured, translated, and added to the evidence file. The response was being documented with the same rigor as the crime. The first detection was the 9th Expeditionary, dropping out of transit at the edge of the Selvari sensor envelope at the 36-hour mark. 42 warships materializing on the Selvari long-range scopes in a combat formation that any naval officer in the sector would recognize as approach posture. The Selvari government transmitted a diplomatic inquiry within 15 minutes, requesting identification and intent. The inquiry was polite, formal, couched in the careful language of a power that did not yet understand what was happening. Earth did not respond. At the 38-hour mark, the Selvari transmitted a second inquiry, this one to the Blackthorn directly, requesting confirmation that the approaching fleet group was conducting a routine exercise. Earth did not respond. Nea read the intercept of the Selvari foreign minister's message to their defense council. Earth is not answering. This may be a communications malfunction. It was not a malfunction. The second detection was the 14th Battle Group, arriving from galactic north at the 40-hour mark. 61 warships on a perpendicular vector. The Selvari sensor operators were now seeing 2 separate formations converging from 2 different directions. The diplomatic inquiry became a formal protest, citing 3 separate interstellar conventions regarding unannounced military movements near sovereign territory. Earth did not respond. The Selvari Defense Council convened an emergency session at the 41-hour mark. Nea read the intercepts as they arrived. The defense minister asked a question that would have been answered by anyone with access to the evidence package Earth had already transmitted to every interstellar body. Why are they coming? The Compact's intelligence chief, a subordinate of Solon's, did not answer. The Selvari scrambled their 11 corvettes into a defensive screen at the 42-hour mark. Their 3 destroyers began powering up weapon systems in orbital dock. Nea watched the formation deploy on the tactical display and noted that the corvette's targeting systems were active but not locked. They were posturing, not preparing. The Selvari still believed this was a miscommunication. They still believed that an explanation existed that did not involve the word they were not yet willing to say. At the 44-hour mark, one of the Selvari corvette captains, a young officer whose name Nea noted as Tesk Varen, transmitted a query to Defense Command asking whether the approaching Earth forces had issued any targeting locks. Defense Command replied that no locks had been detected. Varen's follow-up message contained the most intelligent observation any Selvari officer had made in 6 days. If they wanted us dead, we would not have seen them coming. They want us to see them. The third detection was the 22nd Heavy Squadron at the 52-hour mark, dropping out of transit directly above the Selvari primary orbital trade station. Rear Admiral Cole's 30th ships took up station in a hemisphere formation that placed weapons range over every orbital facility, every docking platform, every communications relay, every defense satellite in the Selvari home system's primary orbital band. Cole's formation was precise, unhurried, and professional. Her ships did not fire. They did not need to. Their positioning communicated everything. The Selvari government's communications shifted from diplomatic language to alarm. They transmitted on every frequency, invoking treaties, citing precedent, demanding dialogue, requesting mediation from 3 separate interstellar bodies. They attempted to contact the Dhurathi Ecclesiast Council for support. The 22nd Electronic Warfare Suite jammed the transmission. The Selvari's only potential ally would not be receiving their call. At the 54-hour mark, the Selvari Defense Council finally received the evidence package. Someone had read it. The intercept of the defense minister's response to the intelligence chief was 4 words. What did Solon do? The intelligence chief's response was silence. Within the hour, Solon was summoned before the Defense Council. Nea intercepted his response to the summons, a single line requesting diplomatic immunity and safe transit to a neutral port. The Defense Council denied both. At the 56-hour mark, the Selvari government addressed a communication directly to Nea. They knew her name. They knew the investigation had originated aboard the Blackthorn. They wanted to talk. She consulted Captain Rand. He consulted the combined authority. The response came in 4 minutes. Take the call, listen, do not negotiate. Nea opened the channel in the cage with her entire team listening, and every word being recorded. The face on her screen was Compact Director Arvith Solon himself. He looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, and who understood that sleep was the least of his concerns. Operative Solon, I am authorized to discuss the situation. There is nothing to discuss, Director. Earth's evidence package has been transmitted to every major interstellar body. The investigation is complete. I want you to understand that the operation was not designed to produce casualties. The Dhurathi were supposed to intercept the transport and detain the delegation. The targeting data we provided was for interception, not destruction. Fleet Prelate Ken exceeded his operational mandate. You provided a ceasefire delegation's shield harmonics, engine signature, and escort recalibration, window to a hostile military force. You transmitted these details through an operative you personally placed aboard the mediation vessel, through a personnel channel you personally authorized to bypass our security screening. The outcome was foreseeable. The outcome was foreseen. The intent was to create a diplomatic incident that would collapse the ceasefire and prevent Earth from establishing a bilateral accord with the Dhurathi that would have excluded the Selvari Compact from the regional security architecture. We were protecting our strategic position. You sold 32 human lives to protect a seat at a table. That is a simplification of a complex strategic. Ambassador Gideon Reach spent 11 months building the ceasefire framework you used as bait. Deputy Ambassador Lena Vasic has a daughter at university on Earth who received the notification 3 days ago. Security Chief Warrant Officer Doran Malek had been in service for 22 years and was 4 months from retirement. Translator Emmy Fontaine was 26 years old and on her first diplomatic assignment. Translator R.F. Patel taught himself your co-conspirator's liturgical dialect because he believed understanding the enemy's sacred language would create a bridge to peace. Those are the people whose shield harmonics you transmitted to a missile battery. That is not a simplification. Solon's composure cracked. Not dramatically, the Selvari did not break down the way humans did. But Nea saw the precise moment when the professional architecture that had sustained his career failed to hold the weight of what she had just laid across it. His eyes moved away from the screen. Behind him, Selvari officials had stopped moving. They were listening. What does Earth want? Earth requires three things. First, the immediate surrender of Commander Ashai Droon to Terran military custody aboard this vessel. Second, the immediate surrender of every member of your External Analysis Bureau's Operations Directorate who participated in the planning or execution of Project Quiet Bridge, including yourself. Third, the unconditional deactivation of the Selvari, Compact's military forces, and the transfer of all combat-capable vessels to Terran fleet custody. That is the end of the Compact as a sovereign power. The Compact ended its claim to sovereign protection when it used a ceasefire mediation to engineer the assassination of a diplomatic delegation. And if we refuse? Nea did not answer the question. She did not need to. The 72-hour window had expired. The reserve carrier division had arrived. The Blackthorn sensor suite registered the formation at 3:41. The fleet carrier Resolute dropping out of transit in a standard arrival pattern that placed it directly between the Selvari home planet and the Keth Narrows corridor, sealing the last exit. The Resolute was a wall of gray hull and weapons bays, 4 kilometers from bow to stern, its flight decks already cycling strike craft into launch positions. Its escort of 72 cruisers and destroyers fanned out in a hemispherical screen that filled the Selvari tracking displays with more contact markers than their systems had been designed to process. Behind the Resolute, the remaining elements of the reserve division dropped in over the next 40 minutes. Ship after ship after ship, each one announcing its presence with the unhurried regularity of a clock counting down to something the Selvari government already understood but had not yet admitted. Nea watched the contact count on the cage's tactical display climb past 8,000, past 10,000, past 12,000. At 13,000, Rossa said quietly, "They've stopped transmitting protests." At 14,106, the last ship took its position, and the formation was complete. A sphere of warships surrounding the Selvari home system, every ship broadcasting its identification on an open channel, every ship at combat stations, every weapons system active and painting the Selvari Compact's orbital infrastructure with targeting solutions that the Selvari defensive network could detect and count and understand, and could do absolutely nothing about. The Selvari's 11 corvettes held their defensive screen for 4 minutes after the Resolute arrived. Captain Tesk Varon was the first to power down his weapons and transmit a standby code. The others followed within 90 seconds. The crews had done the arithmetic. 11 corvettes and 3 destroyers against 14,000 warships was not a battle. It was not even a gesture. It was a number that existed only to demonstrate the completeness of the disproportion. At 3:47, 6 minutes after the Resolute's arrival, the Selvari Compact transmitted an unconditional acceptance of all 3 demands on every frequency their communications array could reach. The transmission was repeated 11 times in 4 minutes. By the 5th repetition, the Selvari Defense Minister was personally reading the text. By the 8th, the Selvari head of state had added her own voice. They wanted to make certain that every ship in the formation heard the surrender before any trigger was pulled. Solon was among the first to be surrendered. Droon was delivered to the Blackthorn's brig within the hour. Over the next 12 hours, 14 operatives from the External Analysis Bureau's Operations Directorate were transferred to Terran custody. Each was catalogued, biometrically verified, and placed in a holding cell. Their files became part of the evidence architecture. Their testimonies, when they came over the following days, added operational detail but did not alter the structure. The conspiracy had been exactly what the evidence showed. A state-directed operation, planned over 14 months under the codename Project Quiet Bridge, to destroy a human ceasefire delegation by exploiting the Selvari Compact's position as trusted neutral mediator. The Selvari Compact's 3 destroyers and 11 corvettes were boarded by Terran Marine detachments and placed under fleet custody. Their crews were disembarked and interned under supervised conditions. The Compact's orbital defense platforms were powered down and locked under Terran encryption. The Compact's military ceased to exist as a functional entity in the span of a single day. The Dhurathi response was handled simultaneously and with less ceremony. Fleet Prelate Dhurathi Ken received word of the Selvari surrender and ordered his flotilla of 12 strike craft to flee the Keth Narrows at maximum speed. Nea's signals team intercepted the order within minutes and forwarded it to the 22nd Heavy Squadron. Rear Admiral Cole had already repositioned. She had detached 8 fast destroyers to cover the Keth Narrows exit corridor at the 56-hour mark, anticipating the move before Ken made it. Ken's flotilla achieved 4 hours of transit before Cole's destroyers intercepted them. Cole offered terms once, transmitted on an open frequency and recorded: power down weapons, reverse course, submit to Terran custody. Ken formed a combat spread and opened fire. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. Cole's destroyers absorbed the initial volley on their forward shields. The Dhurathi strike craft's weapons were designed for ambushing transports, not for engaging purpose-built warships. The destroyers returned fire with their main batteries. 12 Dhurathi vessels were destroyed in sequence, each one accounted for in the 22nd tactical log with the precision of a ledger entry. Cole's after-action report noted the engagement's duration, the 12 vessels destroyed, and the 0 casualties sustained by the human force. The final line was characteristic of her style: threat neutralized, no recovery of senior command personnel, debris field indexed for evidentiary purposes. Nea read the report and added it to the evidence architecture. Ken's name moved from the active column to the resolved column. Every conspirator was now either in custody or in a debris field. The Dhurathi Ecclesiast Council, observing the simultaneous dismantlement of their Selvari ally and the destruction of their most aggressive fleet commander, convened an emergency session. The debate lasted 3 hours. The religious-military hierarchy was divided between escalation and arithmetic. The arithmeticians won. 14,000 warships in the adjacent sector constituted an argument that did not require rhetorical skill to deliver. The council transmitted a formal disavowal of Ken within 8 hours. They declared him a rogue actor and offered reparations, intelligence cooperation, and territorial concessions in the Keth Narrows, 3 strategic transit corridors ceded to Earth's permanent control. The combined authority accepted the intelligence cooperation and the territory. The reparations were refused. Earth did not want money. Earth wanted the Dhurathi to understand that 32 human lives could not be settled with a transfer, and that the only currency Earth accepted was the kind that restructured the strategic map permanently. Nea completed the final intelligence summary at 200 station time, 12 days after the attack. 47 pages documenting every link in the conspiracy chain. She quantified the response: 14,106 warships deployed across 4 fleet groups, 26 dreadnoughts, 84 cruisers, 1 Everest-class fleet carrier, 600 strike craft, 1 Allied powers military dissolved, 1 hostile fleet prelate's command destroyed, 1 regional security framework permanently redrawn. She saved the document and closed her console. The cage was quiet. Vestrin had left at midnight after a final verification pass. Rasa had followed an hour later, setting a fresh cup of coffee on Nea's console without a word. Tsoi had been the last, pausing at the door to look back with an expression that was not quite a question, the expression of someone who had helped build the instrument that dissolved a government and wanted to know if the builder felt what she felt. Nea had nodded. It was enough. Tsoi had left. Nea walked to the refrigerated forensic bay on deck 7. She badged through the security lock and stepped inside. Cold and bright, lit by overhead strips casting institutional white. 32 body bags on steel racks in 2 rows of 16, each sealed and tagged. She walked the row. Ambassador Gideon Reach, Deputy Ambassador Lena Vasic, Security Chief Warrant Officer Doran Malek, Translator Emmy Fontaine, Translator Arav Patel, 27 others, people who had trusted the process, people who had trusted the neutral mediator, people who had walked into a conference venue that had been built around them like a cage. She placed her palm flat on the nearest rack. The cold steel bit through her skin. She held it there until her hand ached, and then longer, because the ache was a small thing compared to the 32 reasons it existed. Then she straightened, turned, and walked out. The door sealed behind her. She stood in the corridor, one hand against the bulkhead, feeling the ship's vibration. Gideon Reach had packed 3 annotated texts on Dhurathi culture for the summit, with margin notes about cultural parallels he hoped to use as conversation starters. One note said, "Their harvest festivals mirror our own, perhaps begin here." He had been looking for common ground with the people whose allies would kill him. Nea knew this because the personal effects had been recovered with the remains, and she had catalogued every item. She walked back toward the cage. She did not stop at her quarters. There was work to do. The Dhurathi Ecclesiast Council's intelligence files, surrendered as part of their territorial concessions, had arrived that morning. Preliminary analysis suggested that the Selvari Dhurathi cooperation documented under Project Quiet Bridge was not an isolated operation. There were references to earlier projects, earlier compromises, other mediations where the Selvari Compact had served as neutral arbiter while simultaneously feeding information to one party or the other. The investigation was not finished. She sat at her station, logged in, and opened the first of the surrendered files. Dense military shorthand that the translation matrix handled at the edge of its capability. She read each line twice, cross-referenced against the existing architecture. On the 14th page of the third file, she found a reference to a Selvari intelligence operation conducted 11 years ago during a boundary dispute between Earth and a minor power called the Tesserin Combine. The Selvari had mediated that dispute. The mediation had failed after Earth's position papers were leaked. The leak had been attributed to a communications error and investigated inconclusively. The Dhurathi file referenced it as a successful operation by the External Analysis Bureau, conducted under the same handler callsign, Arbiter 7, Solon, 11 years ago. On the 31st page of the 5th file, she found a second operation, the compromise of an Earth intelligence asset embedded in a trading confederation, attributed at the time to the Confederation's own security service, but actually engineered by the Bureau and delivered as a diplomatic favor. On the 44th page of the 7th file, a Selvari Dhurathi joint assessment of Earth's military communications protocols, conducted under Arbiter 7's direction using data harvested from 3 previous mediations. 3 mediations, 3 betrayals. Earth had invited the Selvari Compact to mediate its disputes because the Compact was a trusted neutral party. Each time, the Compact had used that trust to harvest Earth's most sensitive information and share it with the Dhurathi. The Accord Summit had not been Solon's first operation. It had been his latest. Nea opened a new evidence folder. She created a timeline that stretched back 11 years. Every operation, every compromise, every leaked position paper, every failed negotiation that had been attributed to bad luck or the inherent difficulty of interstellar diplomacy. The pattern was clear once you had the data. The pattern had always been there. Earth had simply trusted the wrong people. She began building the second architecture. This one would take longer. It was larger. But the methodology was the same. Document every link, authenticate every source, build the chain until the conclusion was not a judgment but an inevitability. The fleet held station around the Selvari homeworld. 14,000 warships, their running lights visible from the planet's surface as a constellation that had not existed 2 weeks ago. The Selvari civilians who looked up at their night sky saw those lights and understood what their government had failed to calculate. That Earth did not measure betrayal in strategic terms. Earth measured it in names. 32 names on tags in a refrigerated bay. And the answer to those names was not a protest, not a sanction, not a resolution filed with a forum that would deliberate for years and accomplish nothing. The answer was 14,000 warships and a woman in a dark room who was not finished. Who would not be finished until every thread of every betrayal had been traced to its source, and every source had been named, and every name had been answered. Behind 3 bulkheads, Arvith Solon sat in his cell and stared at the wall. He had explained the context. He had described the strategic rationale. He had offered every justification his career had taught him to construct. The intelligence operative had listened to all of it with an expression that never changed. And then she had listed Earth's demands. And then 14,000 warships had arrived. And now he was sitting in a cell that smelled of recycled air and cold steel. And the woman who had put him there was still working. That, more than the fleet, more than the cell, more than the dissolution of everything he had spent his career building, was the thing that frightened him. She was still working. The investigation had delivered its verdict, and the fleet had delivered its consequence, and the compact had delivered its surrender, and she was still working, still reading, still building evidence architectures for operations he had thought were buried so deep that no chain could reach them. She would find them all. He understood that now, not because she was angry, not because she wanted revenge. Because she had made the kind of promise that did not require heat to sustain itself, the cold, patient, procedural promise of a woman who would follow every chain to its end and document every link along the way, and who would not stop because stopping was not in the methodology. The fleet would leave eventually. The political arrangements would be made. The treaties would be redrawn. But the woman in the intelligence bay would keep reading, and every file she opened would lead to another file, and every name she found would lead to another name, and every chain she completed would be added to the architecture that had already dissolved a government and destroyed a fleet. Nea turned the page. The next file contained 3 new names. She wrote them down, cross-referenced them against her existing database, and opened a fresh folder for each one. The work continued.